The rain pounded against the tinted windows of the set-in as it idled in the deserted cul-de-sac. Shadows danced across the dashboard, flickering in time with the dying streetlights. In the driver's seat, a figure sat motionless, eyes fixed on the iron gates of the gated community ahead. This was it, the moment of truth. After months of planning, the final move was about to be played. John gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The fate of his family's future rested on what happened next. Suddenly, the gate slid open and a sleek SUV glided out, its taillights fading into the night. John's jaw tightened. That had to be them, the vultures from the Homeowners Association, coming to seal his fate. With a deep breath, he shifted the sedan into gear and followed, keeping a safe distance. The SUV led him to a towering office building, its reflective glass facade casting an ominous glow in the dreary weather. John watched as the SUV pulled into the underground parking garage, and he quickly found the spot to park, his heart pounding in his ears. This was his chance. He had to act fast before they disappeared behind closed doors and sealed his family's doom. Pulling his coat collar up against the biting wind, John hurried toward the building's entrance, his eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of security. The lobby was empty, save for a bored-looking receptionist behind the desk. "I'm here to see the HOA board," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. The receptionist eyed him warily. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's an emergency," John insisted, leaning forward. "Please, it's a matter of life and death." The receptionist hesitated, then sighed and gestured toward the elevators. "Top floor, but I can't guarantee they'll see you." John nodded his thanks and rushed toward the elevators, his mind racing. He had to be convincing, had to make them listen. The fate of his family's home depended on it. As the elevator climbed higher, John tried to compose himself, running through his plan one last time. He couldn't afford any missteps, not with the stakes this high. The doors slid open, and John stepped out into a plush, wood-paneled lobby. A set of imposing double doors marked HOA Board of Directors loomed like the entrance to a fortress. John took a deep breath and pushed through, stepping into a dimly lit conference room. At the far end, a group of well-dressed individuals sat around an ornate table, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Simmons," one of them, the stern-faced woman, spoke up. "This is an unexpected visit. To what do we owe the pleasure?" John swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "I'm here to stop you from selling my house." A murmur rippled through the board members, and the woman's eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. The decision has already been made." "No, you can't do this," John cried, his desperation seeping through. "My family has lived in that house for generations. You have no right." "We have every right," the woman interrupted, her voice cold. "The property is in violation of multiple HOA regulations. The decision is final." John felt his heart sink. This was worse than he had imagined. They were absolute in their resolve, unwilling to listen to reason. But he couldn't give up, not when so much was at stake. "Please, you have to reconsider," he pleaded. "There has to be something we can do." The woman raised a hand, silencing him. "The decision is final, Mr. Simmons. Your property will be sold at auction tomorrow." She glanced at the other board members, a smug smile spreading across her face. Meeting adjourned. As the board members rose and began to file out, John stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. He couldn't let them do this. He wouldn't. He had to find a way to stop them, no matter what it took. The game was on. The rain had let up, but the air still carried a chill as John hurried back to his car, his mind racing. The HOA board had made their decision, and it was clear they had no intention of backing down. But he cooled it, wooled it, let them take his family's home without a fight. Sliding behind the wheel, John gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had to think, to strategize. He couldn't afford any missteps, not with so much on the line. Suddenly, an idea began to take shape in his mind. It was risky, but it might just be the only way to save his family's home. Pulling out his phone, he quickly scrolled through his contacts, searching for the number he needed. "Hello?" The voice answered on the other end. "It's me," John said, his voice low and urgent. "I need your help. It's an emergency." As he explained the situation, the person on the other end listened intently, their brow furrowing in concern. "That's a tall order, John," they finally said. "Are you sure you want to go down this path?" John didn't hesitate. "I have to. This is my family's home we're talking about. I can't let them take it without a fight." There was a long pause, then a sigh. "All right, I'll do what I can. But you know the risks involved, right?" "I do," John replied, his jaw set with determination. "And I'm willing to take them. Can you help me or not?" "Consider it done," the person said. "I'll be in touch." John ended the call, his heart racing. He knew the path he was about to take was a dangerous one, but he had no choice. He had to find a way to stop the HOA from selling his family's home, no matter the cost. Pulling out of the parking garage, John drove through the deserted streets, his mind churning with 1,000 different scenarios. He had to be careful, had to plan every move meticulously. One wrong step and everything could come crashing down. As he approached his neighborhood, the familiar sight of his family's home came into view, its warm lights shining through the darkness. John felt a pang of sadness at the thought of losing it, of having to uproot his family and start over somewhere else. No, he couldn't let that happen. He had to find a way to beat the HOA at their own game. Pulling into the driveway, John hurried inside, his eyes sweeping the room for any signs of surveillance. The house was silent, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Settling into his chair, John began to map out his plan, scribbling furiously on a pad of paper. He had to be one step ahead of the HOA, anticipate their every move, and he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As the hours ticked by, John's eyes grew heavy, but he refused to let himself rest. The fate of his family's home depended on his success. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, John leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. He had done it. He had found a way to turn the tables on the HOA. Now all he had to do was execute his plan. Grabbing his phone, John dialed the number he had called earlier, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's time," he said, his voice steady. "Let's do this." With those words, John set his plan in motion, determined to take back what was rightfully his. The HOA had underestimated him, and now they were about to pay the price. This was his last stand, and he wasn't going down without a fight. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow over the sleepy suburb, when a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the imposing gates of the gated community. Inside the lead vehicle, a group of well-dressed individuals, the members of the HOA board, sat in tense silence, their expressions grim. "This is it," the stern-faced woman, the president of the board, said, her voice clipped. "Remember, we cannot afford any mistakes. This property needs to be ours by the end of the day." The others nodded, their faces set with determination. They got worked too hard, fought too many battles to let some stubborn homeowner stand in their way now. As the gates swung open, the convoy glided into the community, heading straight for the property in question, the Simmons family home. John Simmons had been a thorn in their side for far too long, and now it was time to put an end to his defiance once and for all. The SUVs came to a stop in front of the house, and the board members emerged, their shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. The woman strode up to the front door, her hand poised to knock. When she paused, her brow furrowing. Something was off. The house was silent, no sign of life. Exchanging a quick glance with the others, she rapped sharply on the door, her impatience growing. Still, no response. Gritting her teeth, the woman tried the doorknob only to find it unlocked. Sharing a pointed look with the others, she pushed the door open and stepped inside, the rest of the board members following close behind. The house was dark, the air thick with an unsettling silence. The woman's eyes narrowed as she swept her gaze around the room, searching for any sign of the Simmons family. "Where are they?" she hissed, turning to the others. Before anyone could respond, a creak from the staircase caught their attention, and they all whirled around, their hands instinctively reaching for their phones. But there was no one there. Exchanging uneasy glances, the board members began to fan out, their footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. The woman led the way, her senses on high alert, her mind racing with possibilities. Had the Simmons family fled, realizing the futility of their fight? Or was this all part of some elaborate trap? As they reached the kitchen, the woman froze, her eyes widening in shock. The room was a mess, dishes and pots strewn everywhere, as if a struggle had taken place. "What the?" she started, but a sudden movement in the corner of her eye cut her off. Whirling around, she found herself face to face with a grinning John Simmons, his arms folded across his chest. "Welcome, HOA board," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I've been expecting you." The woman's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on her phone. "Where is your family, Simmons?" John's grin widened. "Oh, they're safe. Unlike you, I actually care about their well-being." The woman felt a chill run down her spine at the implication. "What have you done?" "Me?" John shrugged, his expression one of feigned innocence. "I haven't done anything. Yet." Before the woman could respond, a loud crash echoed from the living room, followed by a chorus of startled shouts. Exchanging a quick glance with the other board members, she hurried toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. What she found there made her blood run cold. The living room was in shambles, the furniture overturned and the windows shattered. And in the center of the chaos stood a group of burly, masked figures, their eyes glinting menacingly. The woman's mouth went dry as she realized the horrifying truth. They had walked right into a trap. John Simmons had outmaneuvered them, and now they were the ones who were trapped. The HOA board members froze, their eyes darting from the masked figures to the piles of broken glass and overturned furniture. Panic began to set in as they realized the gravity of the situation they had stumbled into. "What is the meaning of this, Simmons?" the woman demanded, her voice shaking slightly. John Simmons stepped forward, his expression calm and composed. "This, my dear board members, is what you get when you try to take away my family's home." He gestured toward the masked figures who had fanned out, cutting off any potential escape routes. "These gentlemen are here to ensure that your little auction plan doesn't go quite as smoothly as you'd hoped." The woman's eyes narrowed and she opened her mouth to speak, but John cut her off. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves," he said, raising a hand. "I'm willing to make you an offer, one that I think you'll find quite compelling." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their minds racing. What could Simmons possibly be offering them? And how had he managed to orchestrate this elaborate trap? "What do you want, Simmons?" the woman asked, her voice laced with thinly veiled contempt. John smiled, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "It's simple, really. I want you to leave my family's property alone, and in exchange, I'll make sure your little indiscretions don't see the light of day." The board members stiffened, their faces paling. "You have no proof of any wrongdoing," the woman snapped, her bravado faltering. "Oh, but I do," John replied, his tone casual. "You see, I've been gathering evidence for quite some time, and let's just say that the local news station would be very interested in what I have to share." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "So what'll it be? Your little corruption scandal or my family's home?" The board members exchanged panicked glances, their minds racing. They had come here to secure the property, not to be blackmailed. But the stakes were too high to risk exposure. The woman's jaw tightened as she realized they had no choice. "Fine," she spat. "You win, Simmons. The property is yours." John's grin widened and he nodded to the masked figures. "Excellent. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some unfinished business to attend to." As the board members were ushered out of the house, their shoulders slumped into feet. John watched with a satisfied smile. He had outmaneuvered them at every turn, and now his family's home was safe. But his work was far from done. Once the HOA members had been escorted off the property, John turned to the masked figures, his expression serious. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to do a thorough sweep of the house, top to bottom. Leave no stone unturned. I want to make sure there are no more surprises waiting for us." The figures nodded, their movements efficient and coordinated. John watched as they fanned out, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. As he waited, his mind raced with the implications of what he had just done. He had gone to extreme lengths to protect his family's home, and he knew that the consequences could be severe. But he couldn't afford to dwell on that now. After what felt like an eternity, the masked figures returned, their report grim. "The house is clean, sir," the leader said, his voice muffled by the mask. "But we found evidence of surveillance cameras and listening devices both inside and out." John's jaw tightened. "I suspected as much. All right, gather them up and dispose of them. We can't afford any loose ends." The figures nodded and set to work, their movements swift and precise. John watched, his heart pounding in his chest. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The HOA may have backed down for now, but he knew they wouldn't give up so easily. They would be back, and he had to be ready. This was only the beginning. As the masked figures methodically swept the Simmons home, removing every trace of the HOA's surveillance, John paced the living room, his mind racing. He had managed to outmaneuver the corrupt board members for now, but he knew they wouldn't give up so easily. The sound of shattering glass caught his attention, and he whirled around to see one of the figures carefully dismantling a hidden camera. John's lips tightened into a grim line. The HOA had been watching his every move, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. "How many more are there?" he asked, his voice terse. "A few more scattered throughout the house," the figure responded, his voice muffled by the mask. "We'll have them all removed shortly." John nodded, his eyes scanning the room. The once cozy space was now a battleground, the overturned furniture and broken glass a stark reminder of the high stakes at play. "Do it quickly," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "I'd want this place secured before the sun sets." The figure inclined his head and returned to his task, his movements precise and efficient. John watched, his arms folded across his chest, his mind whirring with the next phase of his plan. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not for a second. The HOA was relentless, and he knew they would stop at nothing to reclaim this property. He had to be one step ahead of them, anticipating their every move. As the last of the surveillance equipment was removed, John gathered the figures around him, his expression grave. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The HOA isn't going to give up easily. They'll be back, and they'll be bringing reinforcements. We need to be ready." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the masked individuals. I want you to station guards at all the entrances and set up a perimeter around the property. No one gets in or out without my say-so, understood?" The figures nodded, their movements crisp and efficient. John watched as they dispersed, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. Once they were gone, John sank into one of the few remaining chairs, his head in his hands. He had put everything on the line to protect his family's home, and now he was in uncharted territory. The HOA was a formidable opponent, and he knew they wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to get what they wanted. He had to be prepared for whatever they threw at him, and that meant being willing to go to even greater lengths to ensure his family's safety. A soft sound from the hallway caught his attention, and he looked up to see his wife, Lily, standing there, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "John, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. John rose to his feet, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. "I did what I had to, Lily," he murmured. "I couldn't let them take our home." Lily buried her face in his chest, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. "But at what cost?" she asked, her voice muffled. "We're in over our heads, John. This isn't just about the house anymore." John tightened his grip, his jaw clenching. "I know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't back down now. The HOA has to be stopped, Lily, and I'm the only one who can do it." Lily pulled back, her eyes searching his face. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice steady. John nodded, his expression resolute. I have to do this for our family." Lily nodded, a flicker of resignation passing across her features. "Then I'm with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John pulled her close, his heart swelling with a bittersweet mix of relief and determination. They were in this together, come what may, and he would do whatever it took to protect their family and their home. The game was on. The night air was thick with tension as John Simmons paced the perimeter of his property, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The masked figures he had hired stood guard at every entrance, their vigilance unwavering. There was only a matter of time before the HOA board made their move, and John knew he had to be ready. The stakes had never been higher, and he couldn't afford to make a single mistake. As he reached the end of the driveway, a pair of headlights caught his eye, and he tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the concealed weapon under his jacket. But as the vehicle drew closer, he recognized the sleek, familiar shape of his wife's car. Lily pulled into the driveway, her expression grim. John hurried to meet her, his heart pounding. "Any news?" he asked, his voice low. Lily nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward the masked figures. "They're on the move," she whispered. "The board is gathering at their headquarters, and they've called in reinforcements." John's jaw tightened. "How long do we have?" "An hour, maybe less," Lily replied, her voice tinged with fear. "John, we have to get out of here. This is bigger than we ever imagined." John shook his head, his expression resolute. "No, Lily, I won't run. This is our home, and I'm not going to let them take it without a fight." Lily's eyes widened, and she reached out to grasp his arm. "But John, you don't understand. These people are dangerous. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want." "I know," John replied, his voice steady. "That's why I have to stand my ground. If I back down now, they'll never stop coming after us. We have to end this once and for all." Lily's grip tightened, her eyes pleading. "Please, John, think about our family. Think about the kids. We can start over somewhere else, somewhere safe." John pulled her into his arms, his heart aching at the fear in her voice. "I have thought about them, Lily," he murmured, "and that's why I have to do this. I can't let them take away the only home they've ever known." Lily opened her mouth to protest, but the sudden sound of tires crunching on gravel cut her off. They both whirled around to see a fleet of black SUVs pulling up to the gates, their headlights cutting through the darkness. John's grip on Lily tightened, his eyes narrowing. "It's time," he said, his voice grim. Lily trembled, her eyes filled with dread. "John, please." But John was already pulling away, his gaze locked on the approaching vehicles. "Go inside," Lily said, his tone brooking no argument. "I'll handle this." Lily opened her mouth to protest, but the determined look in John's eyes silenced her. With a heavy heart, she turned and hurried back toward the house, her mind racing with 1,000 desperate thoughts. As the SUVs drew closer, John squared his shoulders, his hand reaching into his jacket to retrieve the concealed weapon. He knew the risks, knew that he was putting everything on the line, but he also knew that he had no choice. This was his last stand, and he was going to fight to the bitter end. The SUVs came to a stop, and the HOA board members emerged, their expressions grim. At their side were a group of burly, armed guards, their faces covered by dark masks. John took a deep breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Welcome, gentlemen," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I've been expecting you." The game was on. The air was thick with tension as John Simmons faced off against the HOA board and their heavily armed reinforcements. His grip tightened on the concealed weapon in his jacket, his heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Simmons, the stern-faced woman, the HOA president, said, her voice laced with contempt, I must say I'm impressed by your little display of bravado, but it ends here. John's lips curled into a humorless smile. Oh, I think you underestimate me, Mrs. Daniels. This is far from over. The woman's eyes narrowed and she gestured to the guards at her side. Take him. The guards advanced, their movements swift and efficient. John tensed, ready to make his move, when a sudden voice from behind the crowd caught everyone's attention. Hold it right there. All eyes turned to see a figure striding toward them, his face partially obscured by the shadows. As he drew closer, John felt a surge of relief. It was his contact, the one who had helped him set this all in motion. What is the meaning of this? Mrs. Daniels demanded, her voice laced with uncertainty. The newcomer stepped forward, his expression grim. I'm afraid I can't let you proceed with this little operation of yours, Mrs. Daniels. The woman's eyes narrowed. And who are you to interfere? The newcomer's lips curled into a sardonic smile. Let's just say I have a vested interest in the Simmons property. Mrs. Daniels scoffed, her eyes darting to the armed guards. I hardly think you're in a position to make demands. This is a private matter, and we have the authority to handle it as we see fit. Oh, I wouldn't be so sure about that, the newcomer said, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. You see, I've been gathering quite a bit of interesting information about your little organization. Information that I'm sure the authorities would be very interested in. Mrs. Daniels' face paled, and she took a step back, her resolve faltering. You're bluffing. The newcomer's smile widened. Am I? Why don't we find out? He pulled a thick file from his jacket, the pages rustling ominously. You see, I've been doing some digging, and it seems your little HOA has been engaging in some questionable activities. Embezzlement, fraud, even a few cases of outright theft. Mrs. Daniels' eyes widened, and she glanced nervously at the guards, who had begun to shift uncomfortably. If you so much as lay a finger on Mr. Simmons or his family, I'll make sure this information ends up in the hands of the authorities. The newcomer continued, his voice low and menacing. And trust me, you won't like the consequences. The tension in the air was palpable as Mrs. Daniels and the newcomer stared each other down, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, the woman's shoulders slumped in defeat and she raised a hand, signaling the guards to stand down. This isn't over, Simmons, she spat, her eyes burning with hatred. John watched as the HOA board and their guards retreated, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe it. They had won. Thank you, he said, turning to the newcomer, his voice thick with emotion. The man waved a hand dismissively. Don't mention it. I've been waiting a long time to take those bastards down. John nodded, his gaze sweeping the property where the masked figures had emerged from the shadows, their posture relaxed. So what now? He asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The newcomer shrugged. Now we wait. They'll be back, and when they do, we'll be ready. John took a deep breath, his mind racing with the implications of what they had just accomplished. The HOA had been beaten, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they struck back. But this time, he was ready. He had a team, a plan, and the determination to see this through to the end. The game had just begun. As the dust settled and the HOA board members retreated, John Simmons stood in the driveway, his mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. The confrontation had been tense, the stakes higher than he could have imagined. But in the end, they had emerged victorious. Or had they? John knew that the HOA was not the type to simply give up and walk away. They were powerful, ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And they had clearly underestimated the lengths he was willing to go to protect his family's home. Turning to the mysterious figure who had helped him, John felt a surge of gratitude and uncertainty. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice tinged with awe. If you hadn't shown up when you did. The man waved a hand dismissively. Don't worry about it. I've been waiting a long time for an opportunity like this. John's brow furrowed. What do you mean? The man's lips curled into a sardonic smile. Let's just say I have a personal vendetta against the HOA. They've been a thorn in my side for years. John nodded, his mind wearing with questions. But before he could ask any of them, the sound of a slamming car door caught his attention, and he turned to see his wife, Lily, hurrying toward him, her eyes wild with fear. John, she cried, her voice shaking. What's happening? The kids are terrified, and... She froze, her gaze falling on the mysterious figure standing beside her husband. Who is this? John quickly stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her. It's all right, Lily. He's a friend. He helped us. Lily's eyes narrowed, and she glanced nervously at the masked figures who were still patrolling the perimeter. But what about them? And what's going to happen now? John sighed, his grip tightening on her. I wish I knew, Lily. But one thing's for sure. The HOA isn't going to give up without a fight. Lily's face paled and she looked up at him, her eyes pleading. John, please, we have to get out of here. This is only going to get worse. John shook his head, his expression resolute. I can't, Lily. This is our home, and I'm not going to let them take it away from us without a fight. Lily opened her mouth to protest, but the mysterious figure stepped forward, his hand raised. I'm afraid your husband is right, Mrs. Simmons, he said, his voice grave. The HOA isn't going to stop until they reclaim this property. And if we don't stand our ground, they'll just keep coming after us. Lily looked from the man to John, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. But what about the kids? I can't put them through this. John pulled her close, his heart aching. I know, Lily, but we have to try, for their sake and for ours. Lily closed her eyes, a single tear escaping down her cheek. All right, she whispered, but promise me you'll be careful. John nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I promise. As Lily turned and headed back toward the house, the mysterious figure stepped closer, his expression serious. You know they're not going to give up, right? He said, his voice low. John nodded, his jaws set with determination. I know, but I'm not going to back down either. This is my family's home, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it. The man's lips curled into a smile. Good, because we're going to need every ounce of that determination if we're going to come out on top. He paused, his gaze sweeping the property. The HOA may have underestimated you, Simmons, but trust me, they won't make that mistake again. John took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Then let's make sure they don't get the chance. With those words, the two men turned and headed back toward the house, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of their enemies. The battle was far from over, but they were ready to fight. This was their last stand, and they were going to give it everything they had.